Okay, we're going to work on the hat and mittens, and we had base coated the green part of the hat with a mix of the phthalo green blue plus a little bit of white. So for shading, we can just go to the straight phthalo green blue. That should be dark enough to give us some shading. I'm going to use a small 1/4 inch angle brush to do this, or you can use 3/8 inch, or I wouldn't go any smaller than a 1/4 inch though. Seems like it's easier to do side loading with the bigger brush because you have more space on your brush to distribute that paint across without getting a hard line of paint from edge to edge. And as I said before, sometimes it's nice to use some glazing medium in your brush when you're floating. It seems to make the paint go on a little smoother. So I've got a little puddle of glazing medium here on my palette. I'm just going to load the brush with some glazing medium. I'm just flipping it over and loading both sides. And then I'm going to side load the brush with the phthalo green blue and brush it out here on my palette. Just smooth that paint from across the brush. And then we're going to shade the hat here along the top edge against the red hat band. So the paint edge of your brush is going down against the hat band, but you're floating the green on top of the green part of the hat. So we're just going to pull that across. And when I side load, I don't try to do it in one long stroke. I do little short strokes and smooth it as I go along. And that way I know the paint's filling in. So we're just going to come across the top of that hat band. And just kind of lift off as you get to the end. And if you need to, you can go back and smooth those out. Okay, the next place I'm going to shade is coming down the tail of the hat. Remember on the letters we did the highlighting on the right side and the shading on the bottom and left. So we're going to do that same sequence here on the hat. So again, pick up a little bit more of the phthalo blue-green on your brush to side load. And we're going to come down, continue down this hat on the left side of the tail of the hat that's hanging down. And sometimes if I need to spread that shadow out a little wider, I'll come back and move my brush over a little bit from the edge. And that after I first come down the edge, then move it over maybe 1/8 of an inch and soften that together, and it'll kind of walks that float out a little bit so that it covers a wider area. You could have moved up to like say a 1/2 inch angle brush would help you accomplish that too. Okay, so we're going to continue with the shading the blue-green areas, and we're going to move on to the mittens. Now the mittens you want to shade underneath here where the hands curled over. You're going to want to shade under that part of the mitten. And so we're going to come here along that bottom edge, and the paint edge of your brush is facing up away from the cuff, away from the red. And you just want to pull a little shadow here on each side. And you can do it along the edge of the thumb too. And that gives just a little more definition to your mitten. I'll do the other side, and then I'll zoom in so you can see where, well, I'll tell you what, I'll zoom in while I'm doing this other mitten so you can see where I'm working. we're going to work along this edge here. So our paint edge of the brush is facing towards the top of the mitten, and we're going to come along underneath that edge. And you can see how that makes that folded over part of the mitten stand out. And then let's do the back edge of this thumb because we're shading on the left side of things. So we're assuming the light source is coming from the right side. The hat should be dried now, so I'm going to shade a little bit on the left edge of this hat. Again, because our light source is coming from the right side, and we want to shade the left area of things. So I'm just bringing that down a little bit. So now I think you can see we've got a little bit of more form taking on the mittens. You can see where the shading's making the mittens separated, so you can see where the hand's folding over and shading the area underneath. And then we've got shading here on the left of the hat around the cuff of the hat and down the tail. Now sometimes when I'm float shading, I find that you need to do maybe 2 coats, so I would probably let this dry and go over a second time, and you'll find that the second layer of floating will give you a much smoother appearance to your float. But you need to make sure that it dries completely in between, because if you try to float over an area that is partially dry and partially wet, when you hit the wet areas, the paint will pick up and shift from the moisture in your brush, and you can end up with a hole in your painting. So if you see something like that starting to happen, just stop, continue to let your base, your base shading dry, and then go back and repeat a second time. If you get a little hole, you may need to just add a little extra layer on that spot to fill it in. But let's let this dry a second, and we'll come back and add a second layer of shading. Layer of shading on our hat and mittens in the green. And again, we were loading our small angle brush with glazing medium, touching it into the green paint. You're getting the green on the long end of the angle, blending it on our palette. I'm using a wax palette. I just stuck my finger in the white paint. And then we're going to repeat our shading along the top of the hat and down the tail and on the mittens. You may need to preload the brush as you're going along. And I don't know if you can tell from the video, but the second layer of the green really gives a lot more depth to the shading. The phthalo green blue is a semi-transparent color, so you can still, it lets your under base coat glow through. And when you're using transparent and semi-transparent colors to shade, they're really a lot more pretty than if you use an opaque color for shading. And then we are going to repeat it on the mittens. And we're going here on the back of the thumb, on the left edge of the thumb, and then underneath where the mitten folds over. We're going to repeat that on the other side also. Now on this left mitten, there's not quite so much space between the top of the mitten and the cuffs, so you just have a little short line there. And then we're going to come back here on this back edge. I think one more place I'm going to add a little bit of shading on the right mitten. So I'm going to put a little bit down here on this bottom edge also. As that's turning down from the white, there would be a little bit of a shadow on there, but not as dark as the others. Okay, so there's our first layer of shadows first layer of shading for the hat, the green part of the hat. So now let's move on, and our next step will be to do some shading on the red. We're going to use a mix of our red mix plus a little bit of the raw umber. Raw umbers are both dark chocolate brown, like a bittersweet chocolate. So again, we're going to load our brush with the glazing medium, pick up a little red on the corner of your brush, the long corner, blend it on the palette, and then pick up a little bit of the raw umber. And when you blend those on your palette here, you'll have a nice, you think of bottled paints like a candy bar brown or a black cherry, which makes a real nice color to shade this bright red with. And so on the hat, we're going to shade here on the left edge of the hat. And again, this is probably going to take a couple layers of shading. I'm going to add a little more of the dark brown to it. And then we're going to shade here on the right side where the tail of the top of the hat folds over the cuff on the hat. We're going to tuck some shading down in there. And on the red part of the mittens, we're going to shade this bottom edge. We're going to actually shade both sides of the mittens, the cuff on the mittens. A little bit of water and a little more glazing medium. And again, I'm just brush mixing this paint, so I'm using a little bit of the Naphthol red light mix that we had originally started with and a little bit of the raw umber. And then we're going to flip over the brush and shade this top side of the cuff on the hat mitten. We're going to do that on both sides. And while we've got this color out, we can add a little bit of shading to our bird. Let's come here under the wing and float a shade underneath the bird's wing. And you can do a little on the tail. I'm shading the right feather of the tail up against the middle one. And then just repeat that on the next tail feather, shade up against the top tail feather. And we'll stop and let these dry. And I think we'll probably go back and put another layer of shading on the cuff on the hat. The first layer of our shading on the red part of the hat and mitten cuffs is dry, so we're going to repeat that and do a second layer just to build up our darks. So again, we were floating with a mix of the red mix that we started with, plus a touch of the raw umber to make a dark red-brown. And we are going to, again, float down over the side of the hat cuff on each side. And on each side of the mitten cuffs. You can see as I'm doing the mitten cuffs, the paint on the brush, the tip of the paint is facing the outside edge of the cuff. So when I move to the top, I flip my brush over so that dark edge is against the edge of the cuff. And again, we're going to repeat it on the bird. We're going under the wing, and the paint edge is up against the bottom of the wing. That's where you want your darkest shadow. And add a little more glazing medium. And here underneath the tail feather. So we're going underneath the top feather. So the shading's on the second tail feather. And then shade against the second on the bottom tail feather. So the dark paint edge of your brush is towards the towards the left. I'm very bad with my left and rights. Okay, so we're going to stop and let that dry.